Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. England's Economic Heartland Strategic Alliance, just to give you a sense of what it's about and where we are, what we're doing. The Strategic Alliance covers one of the three powerhouses in England outside of London. It's been around for about 2.5 years now, and it covers a broad range of members. I think the key thing here is to say that we are not in competition with others. We are working alongside our partners in Midlands Engine and in terms of Transport for the North, because our competition is global. So if we are to be successful as an economy, we need to be thinking and setting our sights in a global context. And we also need to understand that the investment in our infrastructure supports the investment that's made in other parts of the country. So it's a common agenda together. Now, in terms of we've all got these infographics these days. It's a successful economy. We're a net contributor to the exchequer. So you might start to say, well, why is it an issue for us to be thinking about moving the agenda forward? Because the answer is, like any business, like any economy, if you don't keep investing in it, you will go backwards. So if our ambition is to compete globally and to be competitive in a post-EU world, then we need to be investing in our success to be able to maintain that and indeed actually accelerate, because if we compare ourselves with the rest of the world, we are still nowhere near as productive or competitive as we should be and as we need to be for the future. So, what's happening at the moment, the last 12 months has been very much dominated by the work we've been doing in gaining momentum with the Strategic Alliance. The Strategic Alliance has been around for about 2.5 years now. It's been building through trust and confidence. It's been developing its ambition, and it's been doing that in the context at the same time of work that's been led by the National Infrastructure Commission. So, about 12 months ago, Chancellor of Exchequer invited the Commission to look at the economic potential of the corridor across from Oxford to Cambridge. It's important, when we talk about the corridor, it's kind of a shorthand. It's important to understand that the Strategic Alliance, the Heartland, covers an area that stretches from Oxford across to Cambridge, including Milton Keynes, but it also goes from Northampton down to Luton. And actually within there are some really important strategic assets, not just in terms of business, but also in terms of transport. We often forget about Luton Airport, scene of European short scheduled routes, but also the biggest centre of business aviation in the country. Indeed, it's about the third or the second biggest centre of business aviation in Europe. And we often forget that. The importance of business aviation is that's often the mechanism, the way in which the global heads of or corporations, international CEOs, decision makers, they use business aviation. They don't use scheduled services. So this is actually a key facility. So what the National Infrastructure Commission has identified is a huge potential. The words in there are the words from the Commission's report. They're not my words. And it actually paints a picture of a real opportunity and potential. It goes on to talk about how East-West Rail and the expressway from Oxford across to Cambridge are, quote, once-in-a-generation opportunities to create genuine multimodal spine that will support that economic potential. So huge opportunities and happening right now. But some of the biggest challenges are actually left unaddressed, because what the Commission also highlight, quite rightly, it's investment in economic development. It's investment in skills. It's investment in social infrastructure, which are just as important for realising the economic potential as indeed investment in strategic infrastructure. And that's where we still have a challenge as a profession, because understanding the linkages and the relationship between those two, or those various areas, is something we don't really try to tackle. It's not something we're very well equipped with in terms of approaches and decision-making mechanisms, which is why one of the things that I've been involved with as a CIHT, which is the CIHT Futures Project, is something that I think we need to think a little bit more about. Thinking about how we use scenario planning to actually think about the future and think about what the options are, and then think about how we want to respond to that. Because one of the key messages from the futures is actually we're quite high-bound still of looking back in the rearview mirror and projecting forward, rather than thinking about what do we want to shape for the future. So in that context, our ambition is actually really quite simple. It's about raising that productivity. It's about actually creating the place to invest. And indeed, in terms of placing to invest, there's a bit of a challenge over the next few months. We often talk about the importance of public sector investment. If we haven't got public sector investment, we talk about the importance of getting it through the planning system. We tend to underestimate, or we tend to lose as professionals, as policy makers, decision makers, we tend to lose the importance of actually thinking about how do we tap into the big institutional investors who actually will have an interest, a long-term, 30, 40-year interest in this area. That's why it's quite interesting to see the Secretary of State's announcement before Christmas about setting up a new organisation, looking at how we can use the opportunity created by East West Rail to look at how can we lever in investment from long-term corporate institutional investors, which actually be in addition to those more traditional sectors of investment. It's also about having transformation leadership. We've talked a little bit already this morning about how leadership is important. My reflection, we've already heard a couple of people talk about how disruptors bring to the system. We sometimes worry about trying to predict the future rather than actually thinking about how we have leadership to guide us for the future. Again, going back to the CIHT Futures, really interesting. The institution organised a series of workshops looking at how we, as a group of professionals, thought that how realistic some of the forecasting from DFT models were about the future scenarios. And interestingly, only a quarter of all those professionals involved in that workshop thought that actually high growth, continued growth in traffic and transportation, continued car growth was actually a reasonable, plausible scenario. So we actually have to challenge our own thinking and translate that into leadership. It also means we need that longer-term commitment from government and its partners. I think we're starting to see that for the Heartland area. We need to get comfortable about having clarity on the sense of direction, but not getting too hung up if we haven't got absolute certainty about what that might look for. So in terms of the next 12 months, it's very much about building on some of the challenges we face now. We've got the National Infrastructure Commission with a further piece of work underway. We've got to realise that the economic potential is not just a city's agenda. There's a lot of emphasis, quite understandably, around the global brands like Oxford, Milton Keynes, Cambridge, but actually the scale of growth in our rural and less urban areas is just as large, actually in some instances larger than the scale of growth in those urban areas. So actually developing an evidence base, understanding what the infrastructure requirements are to meet that moving forward is really important. We need to provide that clarity about the direction of travel on the long-term transport strategy. We're not quite as advanced as our colleagues in Transport for the North, but we're going to be starting work on developing the evidence base, building the evidence that then allows us to take forward a transport strategy, using the evidence base to set out our pitch for a subnational transport body. We're going to start using the agenda around the industrial strategy. We're going to use the agenda around technology and digital strategy to start saying, how do we join this up? Recent meeting with Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the Strategic Alliance leaders were actually saying, we don't want to just think about a subnational transport body, we want to talk about a subnational infrastructure body, one that actually starts joining this up. And we want to have that conversation with Treasury moving forward. It's about transformative leadership. It's about being sensitive to the fact that we need strategic leadership at a regional level, but don't get bogged down by the detail at the local level. And one of the challenges for us for the next 12 months is how do we get that balance right? Probably going to be a lot more flexible in terms of the governance. We need to be comfortable that it's going to be a little bit more layered, but that shouldn't faze us because we need to be thinking about what we're trying to achieve. And finally, we need to think about having an infrastructure compact with government. We need to stop wasting time joining back up at a local or a regional level those infrastructure funding schemes that government has split apart. We need to start thinking about how can we use the certainty that we would have from the public sector to go and do deals with the private sector. The opportunities are huge. That prize of actually doubling or trebling the economy isn't something that's going to come easy, but I think we've got the strategic leadership through the Alliance to actually start setting out a course of travel which hopefully will deliver it in the future. Thank you.